Welcome to the podcast formerly known as What If Geography, now simply and sufficiently known as Geography is Everything. Maybe not as simple. Maybe it's not actually that simple, but I don't know. It gets at a little bit more of what I think we like to talk about, which is everything. And that is, we don't have to go very far other than today's episode to sort of highlight what that is, which, Hunter, what are we talking about today?
Today, we are talking about French fries. Well, actually, not just French fries. We're talking about the potato.
But French fries are a very important part of potatoes, at least in my world.
That's an important part of the potato for many of us. But
you can almost do, we'll get to introductions in a second, but you can almost do that very famous scene from, or I think multiple scenes of Forrest Gump, where the character, I think his name is Bubba, he just kind of goes through like a bunch of different uses, I think, of shrimp, right? It's like shrimp,
right,
whatever, shrimp, cocktail, shrimp, whatever. But you can really do that with potatoes, right? It's like potato chips, potato au gratin, potatoes scalloped, potatoes fried, potatoes tater-totted,
mashed potato, right? Yeah, and this sort of helps us in the entry point here to the episode, which is that potatoes, although they have one origin point in the world, have spread throughout the world and become very quickly, within just a few hundred years, become a very important part of the diets and the culture of places throughout the entire planet. So it's when we're talking about the potato, and why are we talking about the potato? It's because the story of the potato is the story of globalization. It's the story of the globalization of food and agriculture. It's the story of wealth and poverty. It's the story of human subsistence. It's the story of human migration. It's a story of increases in human population, how culture spreads and how it's localized. And it's also a very cautionary tale about biodiversity and food supply. So all of those things are things that we'll touch upon. And that speaks to this, what at one point was a sort of local food, which is becoming a very important global product in food throughout the world.
And it's the story, I think, as you just showed us, Hunter, your dinner tonight.
That's right. It is also what's for dinner. That's right.
Well, before we get into the potato, the geography of the potato, let's run through some introductions. Hunter?
My name is Hunter Shobi. I am a professor of geography at Portland State University here in Portland, Oregon. And I am the co-author of Portlandness, a Cultural Atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, co-authored with David Banis and with contributions from many colleagues, including yourself, Jeff.
Yeah. And my name is Jeff Gibson. You can find me on typically on YouTube at Geography by Jeff. And I'm a co-host of this podcast. And I mentioned this in our last week's episode on New York City, but you might notice that this podcast has been rebranded, and now it's called Geography is Everything rather than what it was before, which was What If Geography. And the same great content that Hunter and I are making are still going to be making it. We're just not really going to be hemmed in by the what ifs, right? And I think this story that we're going to go through today, this geographic story of the potato, is a great example of sort of what we're able to do and talk about now, because if we were to try and frame this as a what if question, it'd be like, well, what if the potato didn't exist? And that, sure, we could do that.
Yeah, we could have done that, but we've got a little bit more flexibility.
Yeah, it's just easier. It's just a little nicer. We don't have to. Yeah. And I think at a certain point, all of the what if questions, the speculation, one, they start getting samey, right? There's a lot of things, right? What if the potato, didn't exist is similar to, a similar kind of question is, what if, wheat didn't exist, or what if, carrots didn't exist, or other sort of vegetables? Well, it's, or when we talked about, what if seafood, I can't remember the exact
What if the fisheries collapsed? What if there were no bees?
Well, you're removing a large portion. And, there's ramifications of that are all similar, not exactly the same, but we start getting pretty samey. And so when we no longer have to factor that into our episodes, we just have a lot more freedom to sort of talk about what we want, which is we just want to talk about the potato.
And then when we do circle back once in a while to a what if episode, it'll make those stand out on their own.
They will absolutely stand out a little bit more. Yes, absolutely. So So yeah, so this is now Geography is Everything. Today we're going to talk a little bit about potato, but before we do, just a couple of quick sort of housekeeping announcements. So first, if you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts, please review us. And you're liking what we're doing, yeah, please review us. I mean, if we'll take feedback, either which way. But I really like to see when we get a new review in, kind of helps me sort of know that we're doing something right. And I think we have pretty high reviews right now. So that's always really good to see. So please do that if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, or
we appreciate that.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Or if you're on another podcast app that allows you to like or rate things, do it there as well. I'm not sure what every podcast app does, but I know there's a lot of them. Second is, you might be watching this on YouTube, in which case, you're probably seeing us right now. Hi. Which is fun because that's new. Normally, historically we haven't done this, but this is something that we're trying, and, we're hoping we can sort of do in the future and sort of grow our YouTube audience, in this way. And I don't really have anything to add there aside from maybe like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also comment, which I do read those. I don't reply to everyone, but I do read the comments on our podcast episodes. A lot of really smart people on our YouTube channel, subscribers.
Well, the collective knowledge of the listeners far exceeds ours, so it's great to have an audience that can bring some information to us as well, and we appreciate that back and forth.
Totally. And I guess, with that, the last thing is so we have a Substack for this podcast. It was my former Substack, which was just geographybyjeff.substack. Now it's been rebranded as well to the geographyIsEverything.substack.com. And if you are a super fan of ours, and you're not already subscribed to that Substack, I do really encourage you to. One, I write an article a week. Hunter's going to start writing a little bit on the Substack as well. This podcast lives on there in sort of an ad-free format. So that's, already a pretty, good benefit. And then we are going to start introducing Substack exclusive mini podcast episodes. So these will be things that are really just broadly touching on sort of concepts or terms around geography. But they're going to be really fun, and it's going to be sort of tailor-made for our super fans, which are sort of, we're trying to get everybody to use Substack. So even if you're not going to listen to this podcast on Substack, I still think it's a really great way to engage with us in sort of a more, I would say, personal manner, because that's ours, right? We don't own Twitter or Instagram. Obviously, if we did, we probably wouldn't be having a podcast right now. But replying to every single Twitter reply or Instagram reply is a little bit harder, and it's just less personal. We just don't know if you're really all that interested in us, or if you just sort of stumbled upon this. The people who subscribe to our Substack newsletter, we know who you are. We really appreciate the few hundred of you that are there already. And we're looking to hopefully grow it to many, many more hundreds, thousands even. And so with that, I don't think I have any more housekeeping things. I try and keep them pretty concise, although I think, actually I'm making pretty good time right now.
Important information to share.
Yeah. And so with that, Hunter, this is your episode. I think this will be a two-parter here. I'm going to sort of hand the baton over to you, and I'll just chime in with my witty commentary every now and then.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, I already mentioned that the potato relates to so many different aspects of geography, wealth, culture, economy, politics, all of those things. So we can touch on a bunch of those things. And it is remarkable about, in a very short period of time, that the potato has been adopted as a very integral part of diets across the world. And, with all different places having their own take on it and integrating it into their own diets and their own cuisines.
I would say, and I mean, I think you can do this with only a handful of other sort of items of food or drink, right? Wheat, beer, cheese, right? I think the potato has elevated itself, or has been elevated to a level of globalness where every sort of culture has some sort of relationship with it. Just like you had said, right?
And maybe one of the things we can talk about first is, what does the potato have going for it that has made it so attractive to people all across the world? It's delicious,
it's
right?
Delicious. You can fry it, you can mash it, you can bake it, you can do all this other stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, and so one thing
I think where you're going is something a little more.
Yeah, I mean, you can make potato in a very complicated kind of way, but one of the things it has going for it is that it's actually easy to prepare. Like, if you think of wheat, I mean, you could make a porridge out of wheat, but you still have to process it in certain ways. And certainly to make bread, there are many steps that have to go into that, including, some biochemistry in terms of adding a yeast and having it react and all those kinds of things. That is not true of the potato, where it can be taken from the ground and very quickly turned into something that you can put on the table.
No, that's a really good point that I hadn't actually thought too much about. Maybe I have at one point, because I've never personally made my own bread, but I've known friends who have, right?
I make bread.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, baking is a hobby. People love it. And you can sort of making your own bread, as far as I can tell, and Hunter, you can probably attest to this. It's almost like half science, half art, right?
Yeah, I think I lean more on the art side of things, but I think you're right. It's half science, half art. Right. And I've been making bread for years. And if I don't make it for a while, I kind of fall out of practice and I have to kind of go through it again. And I'm constantly, there's a lot of different variables in terms of, the proportion, the amount of yeast that you use and how hot the water is when you add it and how long you let the yeast rise before you add it to the flour, and then how long you knead it for and what your technique for kneading it is. And then how long you let it proof, what temperature you bake it. I mean, there's all these different variables that can really have a big impact. And that's, there's different ways to use wheat to making food, but for making bread, there can be a lot involved.
Yeah, but I think all that's to say is, bread it's very complicated, right? It's something that we as certainly a modern day society take for granted. And bread doesn't look like what bread sort of starts out life as, which is wheat or some sort of grain, some sort of material, which is like, flour or something that just it's a grain.
It's the cereal part of the grain that we're looking for, and it looks nothing like it does in the field. Whereas you pull a potato out of the ground and you bake it, and that's what it looks like when it's on your plate.
It's still a potato.
Yeah,
I mean, even if you mash it, right? It's if you mash potatoes. I love mashed potatoes. I mean, it still broadly looks like potato, right? If you cut a potato, and you have like a little ball of mashed potatoes, you're like, okay, these still look similar. They still have the same color.
It resembles what it did when it was before it became your dinner. Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. So there's a simplicity with the potato that is, well, I would say probably not rivaled by very many other things.
No, I think that's a really good point. The potato's got a lot of other things going for it as well. It's a very inexpensive source of food. It is a food that you can produce more per acre than most crops. So most grain crops, compared to the potato, you can get 2 to 4 times the amount of yield from the potato than you can from crops. So in other words, you can grow a fair amount of food in a small space, right? And as arable land becomes more and more at a premium, the potato actually becomes even more attractive as a result, because you can generate a lot of food without as much acreage, and it's also more water efficient than many grain crops as well. So those are some things that it has going for it, right off the bat in terms of just production and growing things.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a very recent story. So. You know how like you go to the store and you can get like a bag of potatoes for, I don't know, a couple bucks, whatever. And so what you usually end up doing is you put those inside a sort of dark cabinet, because apparently the more they're exposed to light, the more that they'll sprout.
Right. Yeah. It's the idea of a root cellar or something like that. And sort of a cold, dry place without much light, and then they store. And that's actually one of the other things. I don't want to cut you off, but let me before I forget.
Yeah.
Potatoes store extremely easily and for a long time. That's another huge benefit of the potato.
Yeah. And so just going back to my story. So I usually have this drawer inside my kitchen. I sort of throw things back there. And sometimes I forget that I have a bag of potatoes down there, and I'll get another bag of potatoes and I'll put it down there. And so as it turns out, I don't know how long ago, but a little while ago, I threw a thing of potatoes down there and sort of got pushed to the back, and I sort of forgot that they existed. And I just found them just about a week ago. And it really looked alien, actually. It was like, so again, it comes inside a plastic bag. If we go back to our plastics episode, we can learn all about why that might be. But it has like a plastic bag, but there's just all these roots that have just like completely dominated the plastic bag. It's like poking out of it. It's like completely unwieldy. It's like almost kind of, it's almost kind of like gross in a way. It's like not.
Well, I mean, it's not in soil or anything, and it's still growing, right?
Still growing.
Watered it, and it's still growing.
Still growing.
You could put that thing in the ground, and it's going to turn into a plant that will grow above the ground, and then it will generate more food.
Yeah. So it's like it's happening in my cupboard. A purest example of just how resilient this vegetable fruit, whatever it is, really is. Right?
Yeah, it's a tuber. And a tuber, I guess, is a kind of root. When I was researching this, and I thought to myself, well, I'm not sure I know what the difference between a root and a tuber is. If you think of a root crop like a carrot, you have the part above, and then the root is the carrot. It's the whole thing, right?
Okay.
Whereas you plant a potato, and all those different shoots that will root out from it will
call them tentacles.
Will create more potatoes or more tubers. And so that's the sort of technical difference, is that you have one plant that will generate lots of different tubers, whereas a single carrot seed will generate a single carrot plant generally.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, all that's to say is very impressed with I've never had a potato situation quite like that. It was, for lack of any other term, it was impressive. It was a little scary too. I was like, I don't know what's going on in there.
Well, and I don't know if anybody out there gardens, and if you've grown potatoes before, if you forget about one or two in your garden, you'll have potatoes next year too, because they'll stay there and they'll come up the following year, and all of a sudden you see the plant and you start to recognize it as what it is. And, they're pretty resilient, as you said. Another thing about the potato we can talk about is that it's highly nutritious. It's a low-fat source of carbohydrates. It contains not all, but most of the vitamins and nutrients that somebody needs in their diet. Got a lot of vitamin C, a lot of calcium. It doesn't have vitamin A or D, but if you add dairy to it, not everybody can tolerate dairy, but adding milk has been something that a lot of people have, you can survive on that and a potato, because it's an almost complete source of nutrition at that point. Not exclusively, but it's a nutritious food.
It goes a long way. Yeah, it goes a long way. It goes so far. Yeah.
And as you illustrated with your example, it's pretty easy to grow, relatively speaking. That's not to say that there are a lot of diseases and there are pests that can attack it, and that complicates things. And so if you're farming potatoes, I don't want to say that's easy, because it's not easy, but compared to farming other things like rice and wheat and corn, for example, you could argue that it's more easy to grow than those other things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the farthest away from having a green thumb as basically anybody can possibly be. I don't garden. My house plants, while I do like them, are hanging on by a thread.
I see one in the window that looks pretty good right now.
Yeah, he's all right. Yeah, it's one of my good ones. But all that's to say is even I could almost grow potatoes in my cupboard.
And so another thing about the potato, to sort of round out the benefits of the potato, to set up everything else we're going to talk about, is that potatoes can grow in lots of different environments. They can't grow in every environment, but they can grow in lots of different environments, including lots of different altitudes. So you can grow potatoes at sea level, and we're not at sea level, but we're close to sea level right here in Portland, where we are. And you can grow them up to approximately 15,000 feet above sea level. and sort of in between. In fact, they're from we're getting into where the potatoes come from because that's an important part of our story. They're originally from the Andes Mountains, and the Andes get pretty tall. And there are, traditionally people have grown potatoes in all different parts, all different altitudes there. And that's actually been one of the big benefits for food security, because not only does it have all the benefits that we just talked about, but if there are, I knew there were a lot of different varieties of potatoes, but apparently there are thousands of varieties of potatoes, in between 4,000 and 5,000 different varieties of potatoes. And you wouldn't necessarily know that by going to the supermarket, because we tend to grow kind of a pretty narrow range of potatoes. And then there are other potatoes that, you can, different colors and different varieties and things like that. But, in Peru, in Chile, there are thousands of varieties of potatoes that have, different attributes to them. And, indigenous people wanted to protect their genetic diversity of their food source, but they wanted also different tastes, and they wanted different, different benefits from this food. So that's, part of the origin story of the potato, is that it's from the Andes and it's grown at, in different areas of the mountain range, and has provided an incredible amount of food security for a long time for the people in that part of the world.
So before I think we're heading into sort of more geographic locations. Before we do that, well, one, I kind of want to just touch on, as you're talking about all the different varieties of potatoes, I think certainly for our US audience, we probably heard a similar story, but more within the frame of the apple, right? About how there used to be hundreds of varieties of apples, and now there's, I don't know, a dozen or so.
Yeah, I mean, there's still hundreds or maybe more varieties, but the ones that typically get grown the most, and this is part of the story of industrialized agriculture, which is part of where we're heading with this episode as well, is that we tend to really focus on certain ones and we monocrop them. And we find ways to make that work, because monocropping is not the way that the natural environment really works. There's usually lots of different things growing in a particular area. I think an apple episode, incidentally, would be a great idea. Do you know where the apple's from originally, Jeff?
I'm going to guess China.
It's from Central Asia, apparently.
Central Asia. Okay. So I wasn't too far.
Yeah, you're not too far off. But I think that the apple, and it's interesting because in French, potato is pomme de terre, which is apple of the earth, basically.
Oh, interesting.
And so there's sort of an analogy there. And potatoes and apples are similar in that. So potato, when you have a potato and like you have growing in your cupboard there, and you replant that, you're going to get an exact replica clone of the potato, the mother potato plant. And apples, growing apples from seeds is really difficult, because you get a completely different apple from a seed than you might expect. And so a lot of way that apples have been grown is by grafting something from a tree and putting it on another tree stock to have more control over the kind of food that you're going to get from it. Yeah.
But before we keep going, we do have to do a quick ad break, because
I know we're heading in that
we're a little over time for ad breaks. But that's fine. We can control this however we want. But let's do that, and then we will be right back.
We'll be right back.
And we're back. Let's just keep talking about where the potato's from and where.
Yeah. So,
just the where.
We keep promising to talk about, that it's all over the place, and we're about to get there. But talk a little bit more about where it originated in the Andes. Apparently, the potato was domesticated approximately 8,000 years ago.
Okay. So it's a long time ago.
It's a long time ago. It's been part of the agriculture for a long time. The other thing that we could say is that for most of human history, agriculture wasn't practiced. Human beings were hunter-gatherers for some 99% of human history. But since agriculture has been practiced, the population of humans on the world has gone up extremely dramatically. And particularly since the Industrial Revolution and some innovations and some agricultural revolution type things as well, that's really what's allowed human population to increase so dramatically. So it's thought to have been first cultivated on the slopes of Lake Titicaca. And
that would be in the Andes, right?
In the Andes, yeah.
I guess before we move ahead, I don't think we actually mentioned where the Andes are. I think we've mentioned some countries, but I think broadly maybe
we're just making some wild assumptions, right? Yeah. So the Andes is an extremely large mountain chain that runs north and south through South America. And there actually apparently is some scholarly debate as to whether potatoes originated in what is now Peru or what is now Chile. I think most of the sources that you're going to read are going to suggest that what is contemporary Peru is the origin of the potato. And potatoes were wild. There are still wild potatoes in the world that are not suitable for consumption by people. And we'll return back to that story a little bit. But the potatoes, some individuals figured out that they could be eaten and started to domesticate them. What is domesticated plant is one that where humans start to plant it instead of finding it wild. And they start to control it and start to choose certain plants that they like better and keep growing those. And that's sort of the history of natural selection and people choosing what crops they want to eat. And so, we're talking about Peru, Chile, and countries in that area. We're talking about indigenous groups, the Incan people, but other people as well, of which the Incan sort of civilization became very dominant in the area. Thousands of varieties. Apparently, there are about 180 known species of wild potatoes still today. And the other thing that, when we research these things, Jeff, we use lots of different source information. And one of the key source material, one of the key places where I got a lot of this information is something called the CIP, which is the Centro Internacional de la Papa, or the International Potato Center, which was established in, a great name, established in 1971 and headquartered in Lima, Peru. And this is an organization that does many different things, a lot of different research. But one of the things they do is they work with indigenous peoples to protect the genetic diversity and heritage of the potato. And they also do research and focus on the sweet potato, which is not a potato, it turns out, and then other Andean roots and tubers. But their main focus is the potato. And so they're, like many, I don't know if every food has an organization like this, but this is an institute, an organization that focuses on the legacy of the potato and making sure that the diversity and the power of the potato to be a staple food is something that can continue into the future.
Well, and I think it speaks to its the power of it as a cultural icon, right? I don't want to suggest that broccoli, for example, isn't as culturally prominent, but I don't think there's an international broccoli. There might be, but I don't think there is, for every single vegetable out there, right? The fact that the potato has one is, I think, pretty notable for its impact on the world in a way that few other, and we talked about this already, but in a way that few other sort of food sources really are. And I think that's pretty notable. And I think, just based on sort of what we've been talking about, sort of where some of these potatoes are, where they originated from, I think I know sort of how it's going to go global. If we're about at that point.
Right. You won't have to think too hard about how that happens. So maybe let's get into that story a little bit. How did the potato go from being a staple for thousands of years in the Andes and contemporary Peru, let's say, to a food that has been adopted as a staple crop and really thought about as a local food in many places? I mean, let's think about the United States for a second. And we're going to talk, I think, in the second part of this about, the production and things like that. But, what state is known for potatoes? Idaho, right? I mean, it's on their license plate, right? I mean, famous potatoes. And so, if you grew up in the United States, you wouldn't be faulted for thinking that that's where the potato is from, because it's become such an important part of the economy and the culture and the identity of that place. And I'm sure there are analogs for that all over the
Everywhere.
world. For example, I lived in Brussels, Belgium for a year, and I was part of an exchange program, and I would get together with the other people from Canada, the United States, and Colombia and Dominican Republic. We were from various places in North America, going to live in Belgium. And one of the common stories we had was that everybody had potatoes at dinner every night in some form. Like it became such an integral part of the Northern European, in this case, the Belgian diet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's funny that you bring up Belgium, because actually I was in Bruges many years ago at this point, and there's like this potato museum there, and that's where I learned that French fries weren't actually French; they were Belgian.
This was driven home. If you live in Belgium, they will, and you're from another country, they will make this point very strongly. They will drive this home. Like, that French fries, it's really a misnomer, and this is a Belgian thing.
Which I think if I'm recalling correctly, but I think it's because it's called French fries because American troops heard people who were speaking French enjoying this sort of fried potato dish, but they were actually Belgians because Belgians actually speak French as well.
Right, the
or at least
Belgians,
a large part of them
in the southern part of the country, the southern half, Wallonia, but in Brussels it's officially bilingual, Flemish, and this is already we're setting up another episode. For sure.
But very interesting. It's just an interesting. I think just going back to your point of we associate potatoes so much with Idaho. In Europe, they associate potatoes differently, probably regionally, probably within their own countries with various different areas. And I think there's just so much. Every culture has its moment with the potato.
Yeah, I mean, in Belgium, one of the big traditional dishes in different parts of and maybe not throughout the entire country, is frites and moule. So mussels and fries. And that's like a very typical sort of, dish that you'll find in Belgium. And it's part of the culture of the country. And, in the United States, we have an expression, steak and potatoes, right? Or meat and potatoes, right? Yeah. And so that sort of speaks to something about the United States and Americanness. I mean, just to dovetail into the apple for a second, I mean, there's the expression as American as apple pie. Of course, we already discussed that the apple's from Central Asia, but the point is that once a food comes to a different part of the world, it becomes embraced and it becomes thought of as part of that place. And so potato, how did it become part of the world diet? And it has to do with the Spanish, conquistadors, the colonial power of Spain, going into what is now Latin America, going into South America, going to Peru, and kind of taking over. Not kind of taking over, completely
taking over. Yeah.
And, they weren't looking to find potatoes. That was not what the goal was. But you could argue that one of the very important things, there's all kinds of things that completely transformed South America. But if you talk about what's sometimes called the Columbian Exchange, so what happens when Europeans arrive in the Americas and the things that go back and forth, and one of the terrible things that happens were these European diseases that were brought and decimated populations of indigenous people all throughout the Americas. Well, in the case of the other direction, one of the things that finds its way on a ship back towards Europe is the potato, and how calculated that was or for what reasons. But apparently, the Canary Islands, which are part of Spanish territory today, but islands in the North Atlantic, is where they first showed up apparently in Europe. And I think I have a date on that someplace around here, 1567. That's pretty specific. So apparently there's been some research on that. And so it's 1567, it shows up in the Canary Islands, and then it starts to move into different parts of Europe from there. And so it shows up apparently close to 1570 in Spain, 1593 in England. From England, the potato travels to Ireland, and there's a very important part of the potato story that deals with Ireland, I think, that most people are probably expecting. And it's interesting to think about there's a number of maps that sort of chronicle this. And of course, there's been a lot written about this. The potato makes its way to India via Portugal in the 1600s. The India makes its way to China via the Netherlands and the Dutch overseas imperial endeavors in the 1600s. The potato goes from England to Bermuda circa 1613, and then from Bermuda to Virginia.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's coming back in 1620. So from the research that I've seen, the potato doesn't go from South America to North America. It goes to Europe first, and then it comes to the Caribbean, and then it comes to the United States, what became the United States. So before it was the United States, and it was the English colony of Virginia.
Which makes a certain amount of sense. I mean, if you're thinking, if you're thinking back to sort of the transportation infrastructure, quote unquote, at the time, within the Americas, going from South America to North America was, I mean, I'm not saying that nobody ever did it within the indigenous tribes, but like what a journey, right? Like the amount of jungles, very inhospitable, treacherous land to get through would make it very hard versus a ship, right? That would sail across the ocean and then eventually sail back, right? I think that trip in a roundabout way is shorter. And
then thinking about some of the things we talked about earlier with how easy the potato is to store and all these things really makes it conducive to moving to place. The low country, what's sometimes called the low countries, and they're talking about because they're not very high above sea level, the Netherlands, and Belgium and Luxembourg. This is in the 1600s, it arrives there as well. Poland by the 1740s, the potato is a really big part of Polish, certain
huge
aspects of
part of
Polish
cuisine. Yes.
In Russia, they did something with the potato as well, and that's one of the things that's used to make alcohol, right? And so, vodka is famous for that. And so it's in the 1840s, apparently, that Russia, and, Russian vodka is famous around the world. And the potato hasn't been in Russia for all that long. But once it was there, it was integrated into, the world of cuisine and spirits.
This is almost like becoming the story of like how the potato came to dominate the world, right? Because as we're going through this, it's like, yes, vodka is as Russian as basically Russia itself, but vodka is potato, or it's derived from potato.
I mean, vodkas can be made from I don't know if they all have to be made from the potato. Okay. I mean, there's various liquors, for example, shoju in Korea and Japan, which can be made from potato. It can be made from sweet potato, it can be made from various things. But I think the potato is one of the things that was drawn from a lot. It's funny, the analogs with the apple, right? Because one of the reasons the apple was so popular in North America was because it lent itself to making alcohol, to making hard cider. Right. So it's interesting, the analogs between these two different things. And then the potato made its way to some of the more remote parts of the world, New Zealand and Australia in the 1700s. I think very quickly, once Europeans showed up on the scene, the potato followed behind. And then via England, it was in the 1880s, which is a little bit later from my research, that the potato shows up in Kenya. And I don't know if this is necessarily the first place that the potato makes its appearance in Africa. But in sub-Saharan Africa, tubers, root crops are very important. So the potato, along with cassava, which is another crop from the Americas, have become very important. So, I mean, we can go across the world and we can see, and that Europe becomes kind of the trajectory there. And so if we're talking about European imperialism, colonialism, one aspect of that is food. There's a book, I don't know if you know this one, Jeff. There's a book called Ecological Imperialism by Alfred Crosby. And it's kind of a little bit of an old school geography text, but it chronicles the way in which the imperial activities of Europeans also brought this sort of change in ecology from different parts of the world. And sometimes it was intentional and sometimes it was not intentional. And we can talk about sheep in New Zealand, or there's chapters of different parts of the world there, but the potato becomes very much part of this, what Alfred Crosby would call ecological imperialism.
Interesting. No, I've not heard of that book, but I mean, I think it makes sense.
Right? Yeah. Now, this was something that was in the first geography course I took
way back when
I was a junior, way back in the 90s. This was one of the readings that was assigned to me in a political geography class that really captured my attention of like, wow, this is, imperialism and colonialism. There are so many different aspects to that you might not think about right off the way. And the way that it has transformed agriculture and diets is a huge part of that. I mean, agriculture, as we've talked about in other episodes, is one of the biggest changes that humans have made on the planet. I mean, cities are very different from what went there before, but there's a lot more land dedicated to agriculture than cities. So it's interesting to think about in terms of another classical theme of geography, human environment relations, and the role of something like the potato in changing the relationship of people to the land in which they're living.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's a really fun map out there of the U.S. That I think I've shown you, Hunter, but it's a map that broadly shows how the U.S.'s land is used, and some variation of food production. Trumps everything. Yeah, it's like, well, one, like, pastures for cows and cattle is a huge use of land, but also, growing food that we eat, growing food that we don't eat, growing just so many different aspects of agriculture is such a dominant land use form. And that's not just the US, but it's also, a lot of other countries. Basically, any country that can grow its own crops probably is to some degree, right? So even a country like Japan, which is, fairly narrow and not as wide as the US, still has a lot of agriculture around, such things such as rice and that kind of stuff. So I think agriculture, absolutely the most dominant form of human civilization.
Yeah, and I mean, countries on the planet. The global economy has transformed the way that food is consumed in many parts of the world, but there is a lot of protection, particularly in Europe, Japan, and the United States, for agricultural industry, because the idea is that we want to be able to feed ourselves if we have to. Right? So that particular notion of food sovereignty, food security, is having control over your own subsistence, because without that, you can't do much else.
Right. And so I think we're about to head over to our next sort of segment. Is that right? Because
I think that's true. Yeah, absolutely.
Then that's a great excuse to do a quick ad break.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. And we are back, heading to, I think, the conclusion of part 1 here. We have a few more potato things to talk about.
Yeah, we'll save. There's a lot more of the story here, which we'll save for the next episode. But there's a few more things that dovetail with what we've already been talking about. And then another piece of literature that I stumbled across while I was researching this episode is called "How the Potato Changed the World's History," which I think was published in 1990. So not super recent, but not real old either. The author is William McNeill, and makes an argument that the potato is actually one of the big factors that relates to European imperialism and colonialism.
Which I think we've grounded, right? That, a lot of what we've already talked about, like you had said, like it's the Europeans colonized someplace, and the potato is not far behind that.
And then one of the aspects we haven't talked about is that many European countries go through an incredible growth in population in the 1800s, 17 and 1800s.
Right. And industrialization.
One of the things that allows that curtails, it doesn't eliminate famines or starvation, but that was much more common aspect of life in Europe, and particularly a lot of the countries that became colonial powers, until the potato arrived. And once the potato arrived, it really allowed populations to increase dramatically. And this is also one of the factors that contributes to industrialization and colonialism and those kinds. It's not the only thing, of course, and it's not the sole cause. But this is one of the arguments that McNeill is making, that, one aspect of understanding the way that Europeans, transformed the world through, imperial and colonial activities was understanding the role of the potato as well.
And that makes me think of like I mean, I love the potato, but it makes me think of, and I think maybe this is where McNeil is getting at. It's the potato in its resilience and the way that it was able to last for so long, probably enabled a lot of a larger force of, Europeans to go explore and colonize and do all this other stuff when they could sort of bring this staple food that was highly nutritious, as we already covered, was durable and long lasting and can be planted basically anywhere, right? That's incredibly powerful. And, it makes you think not to dovetail into sort of our old habits of what ifisms, but had the potato not, been a potato, had not existed or not been as resilient, what would they have replaced that with? And, maybe something similar would have still happened, but it would be interesting. It's an interesting thought experiment for sure.
Yeah, because wheat has been grown for thousands of years in Europe and is an important crop, but really didn't fill the same role of increasing once some of the, three-field farming, which is the idea of leaving field fallow to regenerate nutrients and all these kinds of things, that helped grains increase. And so that does play a factor.
Mm-hmm.
But the introduction of the potato, it would be probably hard to overestimate how important that was for increasing populations in Europe. And again, it's not the only thing that relates to why industrialization happens in Europe. There's a lot of reasons for that. But, the rise of the factory was dependent upon lots of different, lots of, having a labor force that was available to work in factories. And the potato relates to that story. Apparently, some of what I was reading about also suggests that the potato actually didn't adjust super well to Europe right away. And then it took some time to find the kind of varieties that would adapt there and those kinds of things. And then also the addition of some fertilizers, which we can kind of relate, which we'll talk a little bit more about next episode. But there is one place, and this is maybe our segue to sort of wrap it up a little bit and look ahead. There's one place in Europe that is really well suited to the potato because it's got a mild, damp climate, and that is Ireland.
Ireland, very infamous history with the potato.
That's right. And
we
we're
talked a
go
little bit
that.
about it in our last week's episode on
That's right.
New York City. Yeah, I won't hold you back.
One more thing, though, and I don't know how much to attribute to that. Like I don't know where the scholarly research is on this particular point at the moment. But another argument that's made is that one of the reasons the potato was particularly well received in Europe was because it was harder to control by authorities for taxation and things like that. So if you think about, or during wartime, it was harder to assess and destroy, right? So if you have wheat fields, which represent the sustenance of a people, one of the strategies for armies is to destroy the food of the people that you're invading and this kind of thing. And then also the way that feudalism worked was by taxing people based on what they were producing in common lands and things like that. And you can't hide a wheat field, But potato plants are easy, the food part of it grows underground. And so there's arguments that I've seen out there in the literature that suggest that peasants of the European plains found the potatoes, because they grew underground, they were less visible, and authorities had a harder time taxing them, and armies had a harder time sort of eliminating them. So that there was this really interesting sort of political military role that the potato had that you wouldn't even think about. And again, I don't know how much authority academics are wanting to give to that right now, but it's something that I found out there in the literature.
Yeah, well, I think especially for the military aspect of it makes a lot of sense. There's very recent history, with respect to the wartime sort of interactions with wheat, right? We're all sort of dealing with a lot of those repercussions right now. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that the tax thing is very interesting. One thing I wouldn't have necessarily thought about specifically because, well, one, I knew that it was an underground sort of vegetable. I didn't know exactly to the extent that it would be so
I mean,
hidden.
you can, if you know what a potato plant looks like, you can recognize it. But potato plants grow,
but your tax assessor's probably not.
They grow several feet above the ground, whereas wheat grows much taller.
It's just very noticeable. Yeah.
Yeah.
But and also, I think going back to the wartime, like let's say you do recognize that, there's a bunch of potatoes growing here. Let's destroy them all. I think we've already established that, well, potatoes will probably just grow back without any sort of human interaction, right? It'll resprout itself, and all of a sudden, in whatever timeline it takes potatoes to grow, there'll be new potatoes there again.
That's right. By the next season, the next year, there's potatoes again. There's all kinds of debate also as to, I mean, one of the things is that the poor adopted the potato as a food source because it could grow in marginal soils. It was inexpensive. There were a lot of things that were attractive to people who weren't affluent, and most people were very poor and peasants. But then there was in Ireland, that kind of is part of that story. But there's all kinds of stories that you hear about in France and other places where the authorities are actually pushing the potato. And I think that's the debate as well, because there's some scholars who are saying, they didn't need to do that people adopted this. But then you hear, and I don't know if this is folklore or not, but stories of French rulers wearing potato flowers on their clothing, or there's a famous case of a potato field being grown on the outskirts of, I think it was Paris, and then guarded, and the guards would leave at night intentionally so the people would steal them and grow them. And so there's again, I don't know if this is folklore, but what I'm trying to say is that class, society, and the potato are woven together in some very interesting ways.
Right. I mean, again, we don't know to what extent it's folklore versus, reality. And, I don't think there's really any way to find out a lot of that information. But I think, it makes certain sort of sense, right? You bring inside a sort of a new, whatever vegetable that is, everything we've already discussed, resilient, nutritious, all this kind of stuff, cheap. And of course, you're going to want your population to adopt it, right? It makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah. What's interesting, though, at the same time, is that there was a lot of resistance among the affluent and the wealthy with the potato because they saw it as an uncultured food.
Exactly, because they saw
right?
it.
Because you're not adding culture to it like you would for wheat, for bread, and these kinds of things. And, this idea that it was making too easy for population to increase, which is this sort of very kind of shady Malthusian type argument, I think. But that there was a lot of distrust of this food. And it wasn't immediately adopted by the upper classes of society, whereas, that's not necessarily a thing now.
Yeah.
But I think it was associated with the food of the poor for a long time in Europe in particular. And that also is part of the story of Ireland, which we are going to save for next time.
Yeah. And I think before we sort of close out here, I think, anytime, especially, especially back in when this was more of a feudal society, or Europe was more of a feudal society with nobility in it, what have you, anytime there was, something that the peasant class was gravitating towards, there was the inverse on the other side, right? So, and I think there's a very famous example of that, and maybe, I don't know exactly where this is from, but I've heard this similar thing about crabs and shellfish at large, right? At one point it was, considered, sort of a peasant food. And so people would eat it because it was very cheaply to be found. You sort of like grab them. They were sort of like, what is the word I'm looking for? Bottom dwellers, bottom feeders.
Right.
They weren't thought of as like a highly sort of sought after food. And therefore there was that disassociation with, or there was an association with them from the poor. And so a disassociation from like the nobility class. And then that eventually has changed, right? Now it's almost the exact inverse. And I think it's really interesting how that kind of stuff happens. And similarly with the potato, how the potato has grown from, well, in a lot of different ways, but now to being so ubiquitous across all different types of people and cultures and classes.
That's right.
Yeah. Yep. And I think with that, we are closing out part one of our 2-part episode on the potato. If you didn't catch sort of where we're heading, we are heading to Ireland, I think, starting in part 2.
That's right.
So
we'll pick up the story of the potato there.
That will be very interesting. And I think most people probably broadly know what we're going to be talking about, but there's some stories there. So let's do some pluggables. Hunter?
I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University in Portland, Oregon. I'm also co-author of Portlandist, a Cultural Atlas, and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle with David Banas.
Yeah, and my name is Jeff Gibson. You can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/geography by Jeff. And you can also find Hunter and myself on Substack now. It's the same name as this podcast, geographyIsEverything.substack.com. You can listen to this podcast there. You can read some articles there. You can even listen to some Substack exclusive podcast episodes. So if you're a big fan of us, we hope to see you there. But you're also welcome to listen on YouTube and anywhere else that you find this podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, XYZ. It's been really fun exploring the potato today. I'm really looking forward to exploring the potato next week with Hunter. Well, we're just going to keep recording, but it's going to be fun. And Hunter's literally going to eat a French fry right now, right in front of me, which is one of my very favorite foods. So with that, we'll see you next week.
Thank you, everybody.